The teacher in the infinite way is both narrowly confined and completely free at the same time. That's a paradox. They are very narrowly confined because unless they stick to the subjects of the nature of God, the nature of error, and the nature of prayer, no matter what else they may have, it is not going to get across. It is not going to complete its function. The minute you stray outside of those three subjects, you're straying outside of the infinite way. On the other hand, an infinite way teacher has infinite freedom because they have 100 million different ways of presenting those three subjects and nobody to tell them how, what, why, or when. They're on their own. They must be guided by their own inner direction as to how soon it's wise to say this or when it would be wiser to hold back that. But they must operate within the framework of the nature of God, the nature of error, the nature of prayer. Now, why is this? Frankly, there is no way to set your student or patient free except that they gain their freedom through an understanding of God. Now, there is no other way. As long as a student is left in the belief that God may punish or God may reward, or that if you wait, God may heal, or that if you do something to please God, that you'll get something. If you tithe, that will make God loosen up. Or if you go to church regularly, or you go to the tape meetings regularly, that will make God loosen up. In other words, to the student it must be conveyed that there is no way on earth to influence God. Nothing you can do will gain God's favor. You can refrain from smoking and from drinking. You can refrain from sex. You can refrain from eating meat. You can go on month fast, but you can't move God. Therefore, unless you understand that about God, you will always be making an effort to please God. On the other hand, if you are not preparing your consciousness for the flow of God, you are not going to receive God's grace. In other words, the Master's ministry is always addressed to you. You must forgive 70 times 7. You must pray for your enemy. You must do unto the least of these my brethren what you would do unto me. You must love your neighbor as yourself. You must seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness. You must not judge after appearances. Now you see, that brings the Christ ministry down to you and me. Not to God, to you and me. Because until we are fit transparencies, the omnipresence that is always there cannot function. It is just the same as a pane of glass that is dirty cannot be a clear transparency for light. And if it gets dirty enough, it will shut out the light. So thus, the first cleansing that we have to do is to desire to know God aright. Sometimes just that one desire, if it's intense enough, will make all of the rest take place in a hurry. But without that intense desire to know God, there is no way to create the cleansing process. We could read books all day and all night, and perhaps if we had 100 years, it would do the cleansing for us gradually, slowly. But what happens when an individual realizes, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free"? When the individual realizes that the degree in which you are holding truth in your consciousness, applying it, is the degree of your fitting yourself for the rest. We had a series in Portland one year that was startling in its results. We had a week of noon meditation meetings. We started on Monday and we ended Saturday with fruitage. But we started on Monday with giving the students a Bible passage. I've forgotten which one it was, but it was a Bible passage that they were to carry out of the room with them and begin applying the minute they got on the other side of the door. Well, the first fruitage that came was this. Evidently that passage had something to do with recognizing the Christ of the individuals you meet. Because the superintendent of the building, who was the relief elevator operator, and the elevator operator, who was a girl, both of whom had been witnessing for about 3 years that crowded room when I was in Portland, and the nature of the work, and so forth and so on, and never expressed the slightest interest in it. On Tuesday, the elevator operator turned the elevator over to the superintendent, and she came. And the next day, the superintendent came. And from then on, both of them were regular visitors to the work and readers of the books. Makes no difference to what extent they ultimately went. Their consciousness has been opened, and someday or other it will be flooded. In the same way, they had to go through that performance on the street, in the stores, in the offices where they worked. One woman reported that whereas for years the girls had been suffering terribly in the office through the men smoking, that all of a sudden the men had a meeting and decided they would do their smoking in the washroom. Heretofore they'd been asked many times and wouldn't do it. Now they weren't asked, and they did do it, and so on. Now, this, you see, had to do with the fact that they were now consciously applying the truth they were studying. But first of all, they had to know the truth, and secondly, they had to apply it. And that begins the cleansing process within, the same as the program of forgiving. Forgiving our neighbor, forgiving our enemy. We do not know how it operates within us in our consciousness, but somehow it removes that particular dirt from our consciousness that makes us a clearer transparency. So that our teachers must reveal to their students the nature of God as omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and say God is just as here and now as the fresh air, but only available in proportion to your knowing the truth and to your applying the truth and your living the truth. So that instead of looking to this omnipresent God or searching for omnipresent God, acknowledge omnipresent God, close your eyes and listen. In this you are not only revealing the nature of God, but the nature of prayer and meditation. So, You can find in the writings hundreds of ways of revealing this. And you may even have original unfoldments of your own. But the point is that until a student knows not to expect something from God without a change of consciousness, and then not to expect it because God's got a book that he's keeping record of their sins in, but because they themselves have made themselves transparencies. Until they know this, they are not to first base with the message of the infinite way. Now, whatever omnipresence is, and omnipotence and omniscience, that's what must be taught. As long as a student is permitted to think of God as a power that will heal disease or sin, they are in orthodoxy. As long as they believe that there is a spiritual power to overcome other powers, they're in orthodoxy. Every student must eventually come to recognize God as the only, and then not to seek the intercession of God, but to relax and rest in the assurance of that omnipotence, omniscience, and so forth. Now, in the secret of the 23rd Psalm, it says that prayer is not constituted of words and thoughts. And many other of the writings repeat that. Then why are not more students aware of the fact that they are not praying when they're thinking, talking, affirming, that they are only at the point of prayer when they are not thinking, when they realize that God's thoughts are not my thoughts, so I'll make room for God's thoughts. God's thoughts are power, not my thoughts. So I'll stop my thoughts and listen to God's thoughts. Why do not more of our students realize that? Well, the reason is that most people are not capable of being self-taught. Most people are not capable of reading a book and finding out the principles they're in. They can get a reaction to it, they can get an emotion from it, they can get a momentary peace from it, but the average person cannot pick out the principles in it and then begin to live with it. Although, and I'm discovering that more and more now, those that have been living 10 and 12 years with the books are gradually, one by one, beginning to perceive specific principles. Yes, if they just keep at it 10 or 12 years or 15 years, it'll strike. But a teacher should be able to hasten that process, because the teacher not only has some measure of the consciousness of it, but the teacher should know these specific principles and present them over and over and over and over again, so that instead of taking 10 years, probably it should take 1 year. Again, the entire writings, every one of them claims that our function is not to improve humanhood. And yet, judging from what you hear from your students when they ask for help, how many are not trying to change human conditions? And that's how many are missing the mark. Because our ministry has nothing to do with changing human conditions. We have discovered a great mystery, that there is a my kingdom and there is a this world, and that my kingdom is not of this world. And we are probably the only teaching that has revealed that as a major principle. Therefore, and this is a follow-up to the nature of God. The nature of God is not to mend your broken bones or to go out and get you dollars or go out and get you automobiles or to kill your enemies for you. This is not the nature of God or the function of God. As a matter of fact, whatever the nature and function of God is already. So it has nothing to do with you. Your function is to leave this world. That immediately sets up a whole new world to an individual. How do you leave this world? How do you stop taking thought for this world? For what you shall eat, what you shall drink, wherewithal you shall be clothed. How can you do this? Yes, but that's not the question. The question is you must do this. How you do it may be an individual experience with you. We can give you some of the aids. I can tell my own processes of arriving at whatever stage of it I've arrived at. But I can't be sure that those are the ways that will lead you to it. But I can tell you beyond all question of doubt that as long as you are taking thought for what you shall eat or what you shall drink or wherewithal you shall be clothed, you are not in the Christ ministry, nor are you following the message of the infinite way. Well, this is so startling. It's even shocking as I sit here and voice it, because it pulls the foundation out from every student. It leaves them nothing to stand on. And that's its intent. He hangeth the earth on nothing. And if you have a single thought in your mind, you're going to cling to the thought. Any concept of God, any concept of what you expect of God, any concept of the fruitage that you're looking for, stands in the way of God demonstration. Because it is not given to man to know the way of God. It is not given to man to know the will of God. Do not forget that ever since the minute we were born, we have been thwarting the will of God. We have been doing everything our parents told us, everything our teachers told us, everything society told us, everything that good manners told us, and in not 1 second did we turn to say, God, haven't you got something to say about all of this, how my life should be lived? After all, you authored my life. Have you nothing to say about its mode or manner of living? And then you would find that even if your parents wanted you to be a bookkeeper, that eventually you'd be what God intended you to be. Or, instead of having your wish fulfilled of this moment, you may find that God's will is something entirely different. But you will never know God's will while you hold a thought or a concept in your mind when you go to God. That is why a great Hindu teacher said, why do you do healing work? To give them just a painless body so that they can go on and knit booties for their grandchildren? Is that what the power of God is meant to do? Of course it isn't. Of course it isn't. And too many of our letters are, thank you for this healing, now I can go back and take care of my grandchildren, and now I can go and look for a job, and now, without a single thought that this miracle of grace might have some further meaning. But the mind was only on that one thing, attaining the object of health, supply, companionship, or whatever. Now, it is for this reason that throughout the writings it says, our function is not to improve humanhood. It is not to get you an ideal companion or an ideal home. It is not just to make your body physically well. Well, this must be conveyed to the student, because the student could read my writings for 10 years and never discover those lines in them, unless they themselves were already fed up with human good today and human lack tomorrow. But for the most part, that is a function of the teacher, so that they impart to the student, when you sit down to pray or to meditate, watch that you go to God completely pure. Watch that you don't have outlined in your thought what you want God to do now that you're going to God, what result you want, what fruitage, because you stand in God's way. You stand in your own way of receiving God. When you pray, you must have no concept in your mind at all as to what you desire. Even if you have a sick patient or a crippled patient or a blind patient, you have no right to want the opposite. Your function is to desire Christ realization, that the Spirit of the Lord God may be upon me and through me produce its mighty works. What mighty works? I don't know what mighty works. I don't know what mighty works. I know that in some measure it will appear as improved health, improved supply, improved companionship. I know that. But that is not the fruitage of our work. That is the added things. The fruitage of our work is the realization of the transcendental presence and power, the awareness that we live not by might but by grace. That's the fruitage of prayer and meditation. I live, yet not I. Christ liveth in me. This is not a prayer for something. This is a statement of what happens after prayer. This is the fruitage of prayer. That now I do not have to take thought from my life, because Christ liveth my life. It is almost universal in my mail that every student seems to have a feeling of frustration and letdown after they've been on the spiritual path or asked for some help, and then they feel badly. They had expected the ninth cloud. They do not realize that this work sets up a battle in you between the spirit and the flesh. And while you are looking for the body to get well, the Spirit is trying to tell you, I don't want you to have bodily health, I want you to have me. And the other student who can't keep their mind off of their companionship, and the Christ is saying, I don't want you to companion with people, I want you to companion with me. Oh, it shocks them so. It shocks them because it isn't what they want to companion with Christ. But the very fact that they have a want is the battle between the spirit and the flesh. And only the teacher can reveal that to the student. They will not find it out for themselves. Because in coming to this work, their whole intent is on improved humanhood. Here and there one says it isn't, but I haven't yet found it to be true. Oh, yes, I have found a few individuals, but they have been a few individuals in the world. And the fruitage in their lives is entirely different than in the lives of the others. The others find their improved humanhood to some degree and get stuck there. The few keep going on and on and on and on, and eventually forget whether their humanhood is good today or bad today, because they're not concentrating on that. Therefore, a major function of the teacher is to bring home in some way to the individual that when you pray, be sure that you're awfully pure. And to be pure has nothing to do with human conduct. To be pure means to go to God with no desires, no wishes, no concepts. Just, here I am, Lord, speak. Fill me with all thou art. The teacher has to find those passages in the writings that bear out that point, just as it is the teacher's function to find those passages in the writings that bear out the nature of God, the nature of prayer, the nature of error. It would be folly for me to sit down and hand the practitioners and teachers a lot of lists for them to work from, because then all they would have would be formulas. Whereas by searching for themselves, they're developing the consciousness and the awareness and finding the particular passages that strike them. Now, a passage may strike you that will not strike you, and vice versa. On the other hand, a year or two or three from now, a passage may strike you that won't strike you. And the reason is that every moment we are at different levels of consciousness. And the only passages that strike us are those that appeal to us at our present level of consciousness. Therefore, for one person to select the passages for a teacher or practitioner is depriving the teacher and practitioner of the opportunity of study and development. Now, in the beginning, you have to give some passages to the patient or young student because they have not yet developed this capacity to find them. It is just like in Christian Science, that there are some practitioners and teachers who live with the concordances. And there are loads of Christian scientists who own the concordances who probably never look at them, or maybe once a year look up a reference. Whereas, if they knew what they were doing, they would be living with those concordances every single day of the week, 7 days of the week. In the same way now, some of our students object to that Bible lesson that's in the back of the lesson. Why? I have given them a new method of just reading. I haven't at all. I've given them the books with the hopes that they would begin to study, but they won't, except a few. And so we have to give the younger student passages to study. I prefer to do as I have been doing, giving chapters for study. Then I'm not directing the student to a passage for them to make a formula of. See? They've got a whole chapter, and out of that, let them find a particular passage. Or if you keep files of your monthly letters, and you're working with a student or with a class, and you can say, the letter of such and such a month, such and such a year covers this point, and then let them dig out of the letter the particular thing for their own need. In other words, try not to be too specific. Yet, with Bible passages, we have to be absolutely specific. Because there, if you go reading what's before and after, you're going to get lost. We have taken Bible passages out of their texts. We use them in ways that the church never heard of. They don't even know the meaning of those passages according to our meaning. Because those, like the ministers who have studied their Bible, when they hear a quotation, they immediately know what went before and after it, and we don't. We have taken that passage completely out of its context so as to get the essence of just the particular passage and in line with its mystical meaning rather than its historical or human. So with Bible passages, we do give the specific passage, but at least we expect the student not to memorize the passage and use it as if it were an affirmation, but to meditate on the passage. There again, the teacher has to instruct the student that the purpose of a Bible quotation is not an affirmation. It is to be memorized, but not to be used as an affirmation, as if by saying it 100 times you'd make something happen. The purpose of a Bible quotation is to take it into your meditation and ask God the meaning of it, the spiritual meaning, the import of it, the application of it. Because, again, one of our foundational principles is this, that eventually all must be taught of God. Therefore, we are teaching the students to be taught of God. We're not trying to teach them necessarily our interpretation. We have to give them that to begin with. In other words, I cannot give to this world, or anyone in it, anything except my personal experience. I can't even claim that every word that's in there is meant for everybody. It's my experience I am giving. To whatever extent it is helpful to an individual, to that extent it is theirs. But it will not stop them in the end from being taught of God. And it is for this reason that we have meditation, and it is for this reason that we have this prayer without words and thoughts, the listening attitude, so that as soon as possible, students can be taught of God. That is, they can turn within and say, Father, reveal thyself. Oh, they'll make some mistakes. They'll get some mistaken impressions based on their own hopes and wishes and ambitions. But, and this is my personal experience in life, I have never been afraid of failure. I do not look on failure as a disgrace. Failure is sometimes the result of a willingness to do something or try something or experiment with something or search for something that is now unknown. And if Admiral Peary has to make 4 attempts to reach the North Pole before he reaches it, he is not disgraced because of his first 3 failures. He is honored because of his ultimate success. So it is with us. We are apt to make lots of mistakes in our work, receive lots of wrong impressions from within. That has nothing to do with it. We are living a life, now this the teacher has to impart. We are living a life which is an eternity. And this space between the cradle and the grave is a parenthesis in that eternity. It's an interval or an interlude. But when we leave this parenthesis, we enter another one. And we are taught, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And here you have one of our major principles. every bit of spiritual consciousness that you evolve during this parenthesis is what you will carry with you into your next experience. You will have that much of spiritual evolution to start with. You will not carry any of your book learning with you. You will not carry any university degrees or anything that was in them with you. You will not carry any of your bank books or securities or real estate with you. Now, either there's going to be no you, or if there is, it is going to be made up of the treasures that you have laid up in heaven. In other words, the spiritual treasures, the spiritual wisdom, the spiritual consciousness. It doesn't even mean the knowledge of the Bible. If that were true, every minister that's ever been born would evolve into a spiritual light. But he doesn't. He probably comes back more materialistically than he was on this earth. It isn't how well you know the Bible. It is what degree of spiritual consciousness you have evolved. So that if necessary, you could write your own Bible. You may be born into a country where the Bibles aren't allowed. And then you'll have to evolve your own Bible to live by. So it is then that let each one make up their mind, as we have had in our, at least one of our New Year letters that I remember, and possibly it's been repeated, that this saying of Happy New Year is kind of a futile thing. Nobody can give us a Happy New Year. That is something that we have to give ourselves. And our next year is in a great measure going to be what we put into this year. In other words, the degree of evolved spiritual consciousness this year is the degree of our harmony next year. And the year after, and the year after, and if we pass on, that's the only thing we carry with us. The treasures we have laid up in heaven. That is the degree of our spiritual consciousness. And spiritual consciousness is only attained through the actual discernment of the meaning of omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. Without that, there is no spiritual discernment. This idea of looking to God as a power is not spiritual discernment. It is a human concept of what God is. In fact, it goes back to the mistake of the Hebrews. We are told that the mistake of the Hebrews was that they expected the Messiah to be a general and a king, and to go out with an army and overthrow Caesar, and to get a following of Hebrews and overthrow the Sanhedrin. But he didn't do either of those things, yet he overcame the world. Not this outer world he didn't overcome. Now, it probably will come as a surprise to you to know that a new book has been released this week in New York on the life of Jesus, which tells us that all of this Bible story of Jesus is untrue, that actually Jesus was a warrior who developed an army and helped to defeat Rome, and he marched the army against the temple of the Hebrews and occupied it. And for his ministry, his home was in the temple that he occupied with his army. Well, you see, the wish is father to the thought. That was the idea of the Messiah. That was what the Hebrews had in mind. This boy is going to fix Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar and so forth. This fellow is going to stop them taking our money away in the temple. Money changing and dove selling and so forth. They so much wanted it that here's a Hebrew who says he actually did it. I know, but he says, put up thy sword. My kingdom is not of this world. We do not live by might nor by power. But our infinite way teachers have to make these points with the students. They have to make up lessons on these very points to show the function of the Messiah. That it isn't a power that fights other powers. It is a non-power that rests in the Word. Not in the sword, not in the might, not in the power. It rests in the Word. And Word, capital W, is the equivalent of consciousness. So you see that so far as subjects is concerned, the infinite way teacher and practitioner is limited. But in presentation and impartation, they are unlimited, because there are thousands of ways in that writings in which it can be imparted to students at different levels. Relax. Remember, you're not to take up the sword. Remember, you're not to defeat it with thoughts any more than you're to defeat the world with things. You're to rest. You're to relax in quietness and in confidence. Be a beholder of God at work. Don't try to help God, or instruct God, or influence God. All this the teacher has to impart. There are at least 12 lessons in this one tape, depending on how you pull it apart, how you jot down notes of this subject and that subject. Then go to the books and find how many hundred ways there are of presenting. The God of the church is dead, and whatever remnant of it is remaining is dying. There must be an impartation of the true God. I repeat it, to know Him aright is life eternal. It enables you to relax, to rest, not to wear yourself out. Yet you'll work twice as many hours in the day and twice as many days in the week as anybody else. Because to know God aright is to be the light of the world, and it attracts the whole world that is seeking. Then comes the temptation to the teacher and the practitioner to get tensed. And unless they take their regular periods for meditation or forgetting the whole thing and just going down and sitting on the riverbank, they're going to get tensed, and human effort will enter, both physical and mental. Then, of course, the message is lost. The teacher and the practitioner, to a far greater extent than any student, must divest themselves of the I. A teacher and a student is not permitted much of I would like this, or I would like to do that, or I would like to be this, or I want that, or I deserve this. That I has to go down in the work, so that it isn't a question of my leisure or my desires. It's a question of the demands that are made on me must be fulfilled. And I must have no other desires but that, to be the fulfillment of my activity. When that's all done, if I want a little recreation, or if I want to look at the television, or if I want to go for an automobile ride, that's all right. Or if I want to take one of my inspirational books and just live with some of the great masters. But none of that has any place in our lives until we have fulfilled the function that we've drawn unto ourselves, therefore have the right to complain about. The teacher and the practitioner are also in an unenviable position. Not that a lot of foolish people might not envy them, but believe me, they are foolish people if they do. Because the teacher and the practitioner has to live up to what they're teaching. They just can't leave themselves exposed to the condemnation of the students. Because well, if you're going to live in a community for 10 or 20 years, everybody knows everything about you that's to be known. And therefore, it calls for wisdom. The teacher and the practitioner of the infinite way must never indulge criticism of any other teaching. Because every teaching is good for some level of consciousness, more especially every one of the legitimate teachings. I do sometimes, in speaking of these other movements, use that word legitimate. I don't believe that an illegitimate teaching is going to benefit anyone, except that it may cause them so much harm that they'll turn away from it and look for something true. But every legitimate teaching. Now, the world has been very fortunate in having dedicated men and women in this metaphysical and spiritual field of operation, starting with Mrs. Eddy and the Fillmores and Ernest Holmes, Nona Brooks and her sister, Mrs. Kramer in California, who did the textbook now used by Divine Science. The man now at the head of Divine Science is one of the most dedicated men you can imagine. The field man for the Unity today, and his wife, two of the most dedicated spiritual souls you can imagine. Emmett Fox. Oh, there have been others, too numerous to mention here, all of whom represent the work of dedicated souls at their level of consciousness. And that's the most that can be said for us, that we're dedicated at our level of consciousness. And it should give us just as much joy when we know of their prospering as when we know of our prospering, because we are all leading toward the same goal. I make the distinction of those who are phonies, but not by name. Let each one discover that for themselves. Or some who are honestly mistaken. Let the world find that for themselves. But our function is not to judge, to criticize, to condemn. And we must be very careful at that point, because I have written and said that our greatest service to this world will be when all of the metaphysical movements agree that there is only one God. Just like when all of the other churches agree that there is only one God. And that those that be for us, if they're for God, they're for us. If they're not against us, they're for us. Now, in the same way, an infinite way teacher or practitioner must rarely find fault with a student, as if the error were in them. Oh, that does not prevent their correcting whatever needs correcting. But with the correction, there must be no sense of the evil as being in them. Because you wouldn't get any further with that than you would going into prison and saying to the prisoners, well, now you're bad men, but we're going to make you good. You won't get anywhere going on a lecture platform and looking out in the audience and believing that you're there to correct somebody or reform somebody or heal somebody. You are there only to voice truth. And when you're in class, the only way you can impersonalize your teaching is when you realize that you are voicing truth. You're not aiming it at this girl and that man and this boy. You are voicing truth. Sometimes some of them want to get hurt because they'll take it personally. That's not your fault. They have to learn to take these things impersonally and know that you're teaching truth. You're not trying to personalize truth or error. When students are having periods of frustration, of seeming to go backward, that is the very point where the teacher must give the greatest encouragement, because those are natural periods in our development, and they keep coming throughout our spiritual life, and sometimes they come thick and fast and often and furious. And the reason is that in some way or other, spirit and the flesh are having a battle. The individual, knowingly or not knowingly, is not surrendering to the spirit, but is maintaining some sense of self. But that's when they need the greatest amount of help, and not criticism, not judgment, not condemnation. I've had some beautiful healings with people who have been to many, many practitioners and who write me, I just can't take the practitioner's criticism anymore, or their judgment, or their finding fault with me. Maybe that is the fault with me, but then that's what I go to them for, to be healed of it, not to be reminded of it. And that's absolutely right. When they come to us, they come to be healed of their errors, not to be reminded of it like they would be in a thou shalt not teaching. We have lots of thou shalts, but we don't have too many thou shalt nots. You see that most of what we cover in this subject of the teaching has to do with the correct letter of truth and the imparting of the correct letter of truth. And so never forget to make tremendous use of your 1959 tapes. You cannot outgrow them. Or the Kailua series. You cannot outgrow them, nor can your students. And teaching for the teacher is the impartation of the spiritual awareness that they've developed, plus the ability to impart the correct letter of truth. There is that double function on the teacher and practitioner of imparting the degree of attained spiritual consciousness plus the imparting of the correct letter of truth, and the development of that spiritual consciousness in the student through the practice of the correct letter of truth. And this, of course, leaves the mysticism of the message of the infinite way. And when you come to this, you lift your students into a whole new area, because now you take God away from them. Because there isn't really no God in that sense. There is a God, but it is only available to us as the activity of our own developed consciousness. Therefore, no one of us is capable of any more God power than the degree of our evolved consciousness. And that is why if we could evolve to the height of Jesus Christ or Gautama Buddha, we would be the full Christ or the full Buddha. But because we may not achieve that, our results, our fruitage, is in proportion to that degree of Christhood that we have embodied. And now we come to the mysticism, which is that God constitutes your very consciousness. And your degree of Godhood is your degree of attained consciousness. And here is where you come to the point that our sole interest should be developing, because it's the only degree of Godhood we're ever going to have. No one can rise higher than their consciousness. And so if you go to Jesus Christ consciousness, you may have an instantaneous healing, but if you go to Judas, you may have a long drawn-out healing. If you go to some of our practitioners, you have very fine fruitage and very fine healings and very fine comfortings, and you go to others, it's apt to be more protracted. Why? It isn't that God is different for one than for another. It isn't that the infinite way is different for one than for another. It is the fact that the only degree of Godhood we have is the degree of our evolved consciousness. That is why in Buddhism you have many Buddhas, but you only have one Gautama the Buddha, one top Buddha. But you have lots of Buddhas at different levels. That means different levels of attained consciousness. So it is, they have not acknowledged in Christianity that there is any more than one Christ, and Jesus was that. But once they perceive that every priest, every minister, every rabbi has attained some measure of that Buddha mind or mind that was in Christ Jesus, then they will know that there are many, many Christs. Perhaps only one who has attained the level of Jesus, but many, many Christs. And it is only the proportion of our Christhood that we are showing forth to the world and that we carry with us as our next experience. Always remember this. Everything else you leave behind. All your diplomas, all your titles to real estate, all your stocks and bonds, all your books, everything you leave behind. What will you take with you? Only your consciousness of truth. Therefore, lay up treasures in heaven. Lay up spiritual treasures, because they not only determine the amount of harmony you will have next year, but they determine the amount of harmony you will have in your experience after you leave here. And if you should reincarnate, it will determine the degree of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that you will have in your next life. Those who are born into countries already free have won that by some measure of advancement into their previous lives. Those who have been born into a free religion or freeness of religion have earned that by their spiritual development in their previous lives. All the others are born into some measure of the same slavery and some measure of the same ignorance that they delighted in before and that they thought was so unimportant to overcome or get out of. Thank you.